Thank you. Holding the sacred memories of our Mahavira, who waged an armed campaign in accordance with international law and moral principles to realize the Tamils' inherent right to self-determination in the form of an independent and sovereign state of Tamilam, I share my thoughts. I also take this opportunity to congratulate the organizers for putting forth this webinar. War is the continuation of politics by other means, said one Clausewitz, a military general, a military theorist in the 19th century. War is a phenomenon associated with changing relationship between parties or among parties. As we see today, Putin's threat to use force, as we see today, Putin's threat of use of force is nothing but a ploy to realize his political objective. It seems to me he might achieve that political goal without resorting to war just by the threat of use of force. So we see the political consideration in that designation of the designation of foreign entities as foreign terrorist organizations and the process of the means of it. It is very visible. Recently, it is very visible in the US. During the Black Lives Matter protest, former President Trump tweeted that he is going to designate Antifa. This is a group, it's a small group of people who are interested in the blacks' rights, who never carries arms, but he tweeted that he is going to designate this Antifa group as a terrorist organization. Then he designated a white supremacist group in Russia as a foreign terrorist organization. Presently, we hear calls from the liberals to designate the far rights group in the US as terrorist organizations. And I wouldn't be surprised that tomorrow if Canada designate the Truckers Association, if there is any, as a terrorist organization. Because what the authorities are doing is they use this terrorism label to achieve their political goal. This by using this to label the message they are giving to the public at large, that this particular entity, this particular organization, or the views espoused by these entities are not acceptable. As former US National Intelligence Director, Mr. James Clapper, once observed that the primary value of designating foreign entities as terrorist organizations is symbolic. So we have to take that into account, bearing in mind, and we take what's the designation of LTT. The designation of LTT and the means of designating LTT as a foreign terrorist organizations are highly political. The first time LTT was designated as a foreign terrorist organization, or for the first time it was characterized as a foreign terrorist organization, to my knowledge, is in 1996 by Canada with respect to the removal proceedings of the then WTM coordinator, Mr. Suresh Manikavasa. Canada initiated the proceedings, charged him that he was engaged in terrorism. What they meant by that he was engaged in fundraising for the LTT, and then he was a member of an organization engaged in terrorism. So it was a special proceedings. It was called 40.1 proceedings. So then the proceedings took, actually LTT used that proceedings as a forum to legitimize its armed struggle, to put forward its sides of the story. So experts from across the globe came and testified. If I remember, Professor Boyle came and testified, Professor Richard Falk came and testified, Professor Karen Parker, experts across the globe came and testified about the Tamil struggle and the legitimacy of the Tamil struggle. If I remember correctly, it went nearly 50 days. So the main argument was put forward by the experts that the right to self-determination is not only applicable in colonial context, but also is applicable in non-colonial context. So it is applicable in the context of the Tamil struggle. And the recipient unit of the right to self-determination, based on the international court decisions of the International Court of Justice, Western Sahara case, Namibia case. And if you analyze the previous recipient unit of the right to self-determination, they identify 3 elements that constitute people who are entitled to the right to self-determination. One is they should have an objective characteristic such as distinct language, distinct religion, distinct culture. Second, there should be a subjective factor, the oneness, sameness, sense of solidarity, real will, etc. Then they should have a relationship to a defined territory. Based on this, the experts testify that the Tamil people are entitled to the right to self-determination. Then they also, based on the resolution, General Assembly Resolution 2625, which is considered as a customary international law, they also argue that the right to self-determination can be exercised in various forms, including in an independent state. This we put forward this argument in 1996. In 1998, the Canadian Supreme Court, with respect to Quebec decision, said the same thing. I am not insinuating that the Canadian Supreme Court plagiarized our brief. What I'm saying is in order to demonstrate the legal validity of the argument, and this court is citing the Canadian Supreme Court decision with respect to Quebec. So then we argue that if you agree that this is a struggle for self-determination, that it falls under the purview of Article 1.4 of 1977 Additional Protocol, which considered that the armed struggle for a right to self-determination should be perceived as an international armed conflict, and the laws of war should be applicable. So our argument was at that time that since it falls within the Article 1.4 of Additional Protocol, international law are the one that governs the conduct of the members. Therefore, they are not subject to domestic laws of Canada. Then Canada brought an expert. Canada brought an expert from UK. They brought Professor Christopher Greenwood. He was at that time a professor at the London School of Economics. Then he became a judge of the International Court of Justice. So he came and he provided testimony also. He provided testimony. As we expected, he gave a very conservative view of the laws of war and the right to self-determination. But he acknowledged that the General Assembly Resolution 2625 has become a customary international law, and that is applicable. But he disputed that the addition of Article 1.4 of Additional Protocol 1, he said has not crystallized or has not evolved as a customary international law. Then our response at that time was, it doesn't matter whether it has become a customary international law or not, it doesn't matter. Our argument is because Canada is a party to the Additional Protocol 1, and through Canada's Geneva Convention Act, it has become part of the domestic law, so it is applicable. But what the judge said, he said he's not going to rule on that issue. He did not rule on that issue. Probably he must have thought it is a political question or what, but he said, no, I am not going to rule on this issue. Anyway, then he said he was not going to get into the details of what constitutes terrorism. But then he said, but the acts, when you see it, you can judge it whether it's an act of terrorism or not. So he said attack on civilian. He cited a couple of cases and said that because this is sufficient to sustain the Home Secretary's certificate of removal. So this what happened in Canada. This happened in 1996. Today it is 2022, and I must tell you happily and proudly, Mr. Suresh Manikavasam still in Canada. Let me go to the next one. This happened in 1997, the decision came. In 1997, October 8th, the US designated LTT as a foreign terrorist organization. So at that time, because I remember the dates very well, because Suresh Manikavasam's decision came on July 29, 1997, because July 29 is the date the Indo-Sri Lankan Accord was signed. So that came on July 29, 1996, and then, 97, and the US designated LTT as a terrorist organization, put it on the list on October 8, 1997. So at that time, personally, I was not very inclined to challenge the designation, but the leadership wanted to challenge the designation. because the leadership was cognizant of, well aware that when it comes to terrorism or foreign relations, normally the courts tend to defer to the government, and they are very well aware of it. In spite of this, so they said, it doesn't matter whether we win or lose. We will challenge it because we'll use it as a forum. To use it as a forum to tell our side of the story and gain legitimacy for it. So LTT challenged the designation, and former US Attorney General, Mr. Ramsey Clark, he was the lead attorney on behalf of the LTT in this legal challenge. If you look at the US definition of for FTO, foreign terrorist organization, there should be 3 elements in order to constitute a foreign terrorist organization. First, it should be a foreign organization. Second, it must have engaged in terrorist activity. Third, it poses a threat to US national security or the security of US nationals. So even if these 3 criteria are met only, that particular organization can be designated as a foreign terrorist organization. But I want to also say one thing with respect to the terrorist activity, that particular clause is saddled with an exception. If you do it for a monetary gain, it's okay. So I thought it's kind of a reaffirmation of our fidelity to capitalism. Then during that period, there was a forum on this on the Patriot Act, and I was also one of the panelists. So I stated this position in my presentation. And there was a panelist from the U.S. State Department legal office. Then he said, no, the reason why the monetary gain exception was put, he said that if you're engaging in violent activities for monetary gain, is covered under the normal criminal law provision of robbery or burglary. So that's the reason that monetary gain exception was put forward. Anyway, so then we'll come to the argument that we raised. First, the LTT argued that it is not a foreign organization. We argued that LTT is a de facto government. Therefore, it doesn't falls within the purview of this FTO laws. Secondly, we argued, based on the international law principles, self-defense, self-help, and specifically on the to realize the right to self-determination, LTT has the right to use force. Number 3, then we argued that LTT is not a threat to US security or not a threat to any country's security. LTT, in fact, wants to have a friendly relationship with all nations in the world. So these are the crux of the arguments put forward. So the court said, whether it is a de facto government or whether it is a foreign organization, that question should be decided by the Secretary of State. They said that is a political question. We do not have expertise to decide, so we leave that to the state, the Secretary of State. With respect to the question whether LTT constitutes a threat to the US security or national, they said that question is also a political question. We leave it to the Secretary of State. We are not going to say anything on that. So out of 3 criteria, 2 criteria, they say no, they cannot decide on it. They simply defer whatever the Secretary of State says. With respect to the national liberation argument and the engage in terrorist activity, again, the US court also, they found there was an evidence, there was an attack on a police station. So they said attack on a police station cannot be classified as a legitimate military activity in an armed conflict. That particular attack constitutes a terrorist activity. So that is sufficient to sustain the designation, designation of LTT as a terrorist organization. So even though we lost in the court of law, we thought it was a moral victory for us because we exposed that the whole the designation of foreign terrorist organization exercise is nothing but a political act. You are using the law to try to gain legitimacy for a political act. So then we filed a petition for rehearing, arguing that the Secretary of State is using the court to gain legitimacy through getting a judicial imprimatur for a political decision, and that violates the very integrity of the judiciary itself. So we made that argument, but we did not prevail on that argument. So then that was the only that's the only initial only challenge we mounted in the US. But then after what happened, even after the LTT has silenced its guns in 2009, it is being routinely renewed. So the last designation expired in August of 2021. In May of 2021, or sorry, July of 2021, the TGT, we filed a petition with the Secretary of State asking him not to renew the LTT as a foreign terrorist organization, because the key point in the law is whether it is presently engaged in terrorist activity. That is the key part of the law. So our position is, since 2009, it has been the guns have been silent. There are no military activities whatsoever. So therefore it should not be renewed. And the designation expires in this August. But thus far, the State Department has not made any decision. So technically speaking, LTT is not on the list. But in the US, we have 3 tiers of terrorist organization. One is tier 1, that's where the Secretary of State puts it on the list. Tier 2, the Treasury Department put it on the list. And tier 3, that you don't have to put it on the list. If 2 people are engaged in violent activities, that is sufficient to say that that organization is a foreign terrorist organization. But regarding the first one, thus far, the Secretary of State has not made any decision. Then we go to India. In India, LTT is banned, not because LTT is engaged in any terrorist activity. The reason LTT is banned in India alleges that LTT is a threat to India's territorial integrity. They got some old map from unknown source that talks about Greater Tamiluram, and they are still arguing, saying that, well, LTT is a threat to India's territorial integrity. That's the argument they are making. They are not making any argument, even though there may be press reports. There are some people who are trying to revive the LTT, so forth. Their main argument in the court that LTT is a threat to India's territorial integrity. It is a political argument. Argue on if it's true. The proper way to respond to that, to have a political engagement. You mark in the marketplace of idea, you put forward your idea and say why India should remain as it is now. That is the proper way to handle political debate. But what the authorities are doing, they are using law to advance political goal, to advance their politics, naked politics. That's what happening all over the world. So anyway, then we challenge that one also. TGT challenge, I also challenge personally. So the court said that our main argument is LTT's goal is a establishment of an independent state. Our goal, TGT's goal, is an establishment of an independent state. So because of this terrorist designation of the LTT, there is a chilling effect on of advocacy work by the people in India. That is true. Whenever we have any webinar or any meeting in India, the first thing they say, please remove the ban. They say, if you remove the ban only, we can do any work in Tamil Nadu. So we put all those things and we filed a petition asking the tribunal to nullify the ban. Then the government came and argued. They did not argue on the merits. That's what because since 1990, it has been routinely challenged by many people. Vaiko has challenged, Mr. Nadumaran has challenged, a lot of people have challenged. Last time, we also challenged. So what the government said, TGT is not banned in India. TGT can come and do any kind of political work they want, and personally, Rudrakumaran can come and do any kind of political work in India. Therefore, they don't have standing, because probably in legal, if you are going to challenge something, that's one of the important things is you have to first establish standing. You have to show that how this law affects you. Then only you can pursue the case. This is a preliminary thing. So what the government came and they did not argue on the merits. They argue these people have no right to challenge the ban. So the tribunal agreed with them, dismissed the case. Now we are now in the process of filing an appeal, saying no, we have standing because it affects, this ban affects our political work. So that's where it's happening. Then we come to UK. UK also they routinely just renew the ban. So the last time, then we challenge it. The thing initially we got a political victory on a procedural ground. The tribunal said that procedurally it was wrong. So they vacated not vacated, they said it was misstated. Then they sent it back because the government argued if the court makes a decision that it was the decision that the procedure was flawed, then please send it back to the Secretary of State and give her another opportunity to make a new decision. But again, as expected, she cited 3 incidents because they have to prove that that something happened recently. They cannot say LTT did that and this in 2004, 1992. They cannot do that now. They have to come up with some recent events. So they came up with some 3 incidents. Those 3 incidents, to be honest with you, it was news to me. I didn't even know those things happened. They cited 3 incidents. There was a attempt of cyber attack of the Sri Lankan mission in Kerala. And they arrested, and there's another person was arrested. He died while he was being caught. He was a former LTT member trying to make bomb. And they arrested a lady in the bus he was carrying a handbag, and the handbag there was a bomb. So these 3 instances, and these are instances given by the Sri Lankan government, not by an independent source. This is the party to the conflict. Who wants to keep the LTT on the list. So the UK Secretary of State rely on that, and she has extended the ban, renewed the ban. So we challenge it again. The case is currently pending in the UK tribunal. So as what I have shown you, the whole thing is nothing but politics. And and also sometimes when you read the reasons or rationales given by the authorities, I was left dumbfounded because in one of the Canadian cases, the Suresh Manickavasan case says that if Suresh Manickavasan wins, then diaspora will celebrate. Then it will be a victory for LTT. These
Excuse
kind
me,
of arguments.
Mr. Rudrakumar, yeah, we are running out of time, but you can sum it up in maybe a minute.
I'll sum it up. Okay,
yeah,
but I want to sum it up. So that's what, but even though we know it is a political decision, we have to challenge it. So in fact, we consider our litigation. Our litigation is also a continuation of the politics by other means. The mode of struggle is changed. The modus operandi is changed, but the goals remains the same. The struggle continues. Tamil's destiny in Tamil's hand. The thirst of Tamils is Tamilagula.
Good evening, and thank you to the organizing committee for holding this conference on a necessary topic to fight for justice for Ulam Tamils. And as lawyer Rudrakumaran Vishwanathan had critically examined the terrorist label prescribed to the LTT, outlining how it came to be and how it continues to step into the political front even years after, just solidifies how important it is for us to discuss on these issues and work towards eradicating them. So today I'd like to present on how the LTT listing is affecting youth specifically. And so I'd like to analyze the impact the listing has had on Tamil youth and their future pursuits by focusing on 3 major events that took place in Canada. And I'll concentrate on how the political labeling and globalization of the Sri Lankan conflict to be seen on a war on terror has impacted the Tamil youth politically, legally, and socially. So the Sri Lankan government labeling of the LTT as a terrorist organization manipulated the focus of the war. The terrorist label was often affiliated with the Tamil population of Sri Lanka, even in the 1970s, when the Tamil militant groups took part in small-scale attacks. So validating the terrorist label, the Sri Lankan government brought into effect the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which permitted arrests for unspecified, unlawful activities without warrant and permits detention for up to 18 months without authorities producing the suspect before court pre-trial. And so this was written in ambiguous terms, allowing the government to arbitrarily detain Tamil civilians and peaceful activists, to put them through brutal treatment, to imprison them under false allegations, while arbitrarily detaining innocent civilians through the PTA, state enforced security forces, to also fire in no-fire zones and physically tortured several Tamil women and men. And despite the knowledge of this, the international community and civil society actors remained hesitant to support a group with a terrorist label, especially after the 9/11 terrorist attack in the United States. Global focus, with specific to the Western world, became heavily focused on anti-terror initiatives, which ultimately weakened the LTT's legitimacy. And so the systematic incorporation of the terrorism into the Sri Lankan political discourse had globalized to shift the focus of the war. Most diaspora Tamils who saw the LTT as their sole representative in the state also promoted their stance on the conflict in their host countries through various means of lobbying, including protests, demonstrations, and through diaspora-run media outlets. But its mediation-seeking international aid was limited and inefficient due to the existing political label. So when using the rhetoric of terrorism, it's important to understand the consequences and power of it. There are many negative implications with listing groups or people as terrorists, as it discredits them, dehumanizes them, and categorizes them as people who cannot be reasoned with. And in all this, the history and root causes to their grievances are ignored, diverts attention away from the existing problematic policies with the current system, and denies space for negotiation. So as such, the listing of the LTT as a terrorist organization has had impeding effects on Tamil citizens. Even after the defeat of the LTT in May 2009, the existing listing continues to distort the perception of who Tamils are, labeling them as terrorists. Especially the Tamil youth have seen to be radicalized as violent individuals. Canada's Anti-Terrorism Act had prescribed the LTT as a terrorist organization in April 2006, the year the European Union had also done so, when it was in the midst of participating in an internationally brokered peace process with the government of Sri Lanka, with legal recognition as a recognized entity. And as a consequence of this, Tamils in Canada grew victims of racial profiling, targeting, discrimination, oppression, and importantly, racialized as terrorists. So legally, the Canadian courts began racialization against Tamils as early as the 1990s, as we heard from lawyer Rudrakumaran in the case of Suresh versus Canada. And so for background, Suresh Manikavasavam was the leader of the World Tamil Movement, which was legally registered as a charitable body under Canadian law that had been operating for 22 years, providing various services, including settlement, cultural, and social services. The Suresh versus Canada case came to an end in 2002 in the Supreme Court of Canada with the decision known as the Suresh exception. Here, going against Canada's international legal obligation to the principle of non-refoulement, Mr. Suresh's case legalized the deportation of a non-citizen where there was a possible threat of torture, as it was in the interest of national security. Rather than obliging to secure Mr. Suresh, who was at a threat of torture if deported, he was racialized as a terror to public safety. Mr. Suresh's identity as a Tamil man supporting a nationalist cause, a member of the Tamil community, and holding a prominent position within the World Tamil Movement was sufficient to rule him as a member of a terrorist organization. And ironically, as compared to other security certificate cases, Mr. Suresh's case did not depend on the warrant of a criminal or violent act, but rather based on racial profile. So Canada's listing altered the perception of organizing initiatives taken by the Tamil community, making them criminalized and labeled them as terrorist activity. Standing out as one of the many cases, the Suresh versus Canada is a prominent example to identify how the listing of the LTT impeded on the investigation process legally and encouraged the labeling of the entire Tamil community as terrorists. Another significant event demonstrating these negative consequences of the LTT listing on Tamil youth specifically is the May 2009 protest that took place in Toronto on the Gardiner Expressway. The protesters who gathered here during the last phase of the armed conflict were demanding the Canadian and international intervention to establish a ceasefire in Sri Lanka with the mass reporting of Tamil civilian deaths. What was perceived from this event by the Canadian authorities, media, and even Western observers were the endanger to public safety, concern for the safety of children, and the presence of women and children who were accompanying the blockage created at the protest. In doing so, the intent of the protest on gaining attention towards the mass killing of Tamil civilians was ignored and rather used as an opportunity to continue racialize and label the Tamil diaspora youth as terrorists. And ironically, the real threat to safety this day was the enforcement of 100 armed police forces at the protest threatening to use tear gas. Responding to the officials' concerns on the safety of children and women, this was the exact argument put forth by the hundreds and thousands of protesters who had gathered on the Gardiner Expressway demanding intervention to safeguard the innocent civilians being killed. Since the prescription of the LTT as a terrorist organization in 2006, the entire Tamil community was racialized and labeled, leading them to be criticized for voicing out their concerns through such protests. The terrorism label became an acceptable term to reference the Tamil community with. Even media representations were seen using the us and them dynamic, setting apart the Tamils as who were labeled as terrorists apart from the rest of the nation. Such racialization against Tamils increased surveillance of Tamil youth. This event raises an important question for us to note when studying the impact of the rhetoric of terrorism, questioning whose lives actually matter. The intensifying views of the Tamil community as terrorists had also resulted in Tamils being denied basic protections of political rights. And in that case, the MV Ocean Lady in October 2009 and the MV Sansi in August 2010 were two ships carrying Tamils fleeing the Sri Lankan Civil War to Canada. While many organizations, including the Canadian Council for Refugees, Amnesty International Canada, and the Canadian Tamil Congress requested respect the rights of the passengers as a response to the terrorist label automatically being given to the asylum seekers on the ship, the Canadian government's response was rather contradictory. In both cases, media and officials were quick to identify the passengers as illegal immigrants, human smugglers, and terrorists, leading to intense inquiries and the detention of, the refugees who arrived on the ship, when in reality, these were just survivors of the genocide. So the rhetoric of terrorism here again became tied to gender norms as well, where women and children were given lenience and given a family image where men were merely seen as members of families, but rather seen as individuals, thus holding a higher level of threat. Those who arrived on both the Sansi and the Ocean Lady were faced with various difficulties in attaining a refugee status, as the Canadian government had put forth inconceivable policies and legislations in place, identifying them as people smugglers, which complicated the process for the Tamil asylum seekers. So these three cases put together outline how the rhetoric of terrorism has had and continues to have a deep scar on the identity of the Tamil community. Tamil activism and community organizing continues to be perceived with the potential threat of violence and risk due to the existing listing of the LTT as a terrorist organization. So rather than labeling and racializing Tamils, a more effective approach to this issue would be to examine the impact of such targeting on Tamils instead of scholars focusing their studies on the so-called identity crisis the Tamil diaspora, more specifically Tamil youth face, and being separated from their home country and settling in their host nation. So it's important to question here what the root causes of these issues are. The blunt reality is that the Sri Lankan government fought against its own citizens, and the Sri Lankan government has been reluctant to respond to the international intervention regarding these allegations simply by putting forth an argument of counterterrorism. It's an undeniable fact that the listing of the LTT terrorist organization has hampered the Tamil community. There's a blanket that all Tamils are terrorists. Media and officials continue to target Tamil youth groups in schools and Tamil student associations at various universities through revoking their status and restricting the use of Tamil language and the Tamil Liberation Flag. In a 2010 report released by the International Crisis Group titled The Sri Lankan Tamil Diaspora After the LTT, this report had focus put towards identifying faults in the Tamils' continued demand for a separate state. Where a major concern I found was the report was constantly radicalizing the diaspora of Tamil youth. So civil society organizations and academic research continues to radicalize and racialize Tamil youth as terrorists. Scholarly research and media representation needs to be altered to set aside the sociological factors differentiating against Tamils. The attention needs to be given towards understanding the impact the listing has had on Tamil youth as opposed to immediately labeling them as terrorists. So I'd like to end off here by stating that it's important to work towards the delisting of the LTT to remove the racialization, radicalization, and discrimination Tamils continue to face, and to eliminate the barriers the terrorist label has forced Tamil youth to continue to face till date today. Thank you.
Against the background of what has already been said, and we have had three very invaluable presentations, our Prime Minister, Rudrakumaran Viswanathan, pointed out the aspects of terrorist designation and how that is continued by various nuances of political discourse and actions. Then we had also a presentation by Abina on different levels at which the youth in Canada particularly see the listing of LTTE as a terrorist organization and the impacts it's having on their education, on their future pursuits. Mr. J. Chandran Gobinath gave us a very comprehensive view of, and very valuable view, in fact, of the different approaches to peace, which had been laid before us as forms of traps into which various groups and entities have fallen into, and the need to be, therefore, be cautious as we engage in similar forms of discourse in the future. Therefore, in the context of what had already been said or enunciated by these three great speakers, my little task would be to give you very briefly some of the serious consequences of listing of LTTE as a terrorist organization in various countries, largely by the European Union and also by the United States, and particularly in Canada. If I wish to draw your attention to some of these consequences which personally affect us and also which affect us collectively as a community in Canada. Speaking of the different efforts made in terms of, particularly by the Norwegian government, in retrospect, we lament the unfortunate turn of events that the listing was in fact enacted and enforced midway through the peace negotiations and without any humanitarian concern, with total insensitivity to the protection of Tamil civilians in the war zone, as well as a denial of protection to the members of the Sri Lanka monitoring mission, as they brought in the listing. 3 out of the 5 were drawn from countries that are members of the European Union itself. And that's why the LTTE later on issued a deadline for the removal of monitors from those 3 countries, namely Denmark, Finland, and Sweden. Later on, report was done, a study report with, I would say there have been a number of lacunas or vacuums in that report. Pawns of Peace, evaluation of Norwegian peace efforts in Sri Lanka from 1997 to 2009. The report was produced in 2011, and it laments the fact that the EU listing of the LTTE had very important implications for the Sri Lanka monitoring mission. And it also says that the head of mission at that time, the Swedish retired Major General Ulf Henriksson, had personally intervened and sent a memo arguing against the ban, saying that there are immediate negative consequences for the Sri Lanka monitoring mission and it could aggravate the escalating dynamics of violence. Certainly, Norway did not intervene in the EU decision as Norway is not a member, but also it made it clear that, the ban will have negative consequences mainly for the monitoring mission, leaving aside the consequences that it will have for the people. And we all know that Canada brought in the ban on 10th of April 2006, and the Council of the European Union followed suit on 30th May 2006. Among them, Norway is the only country that was among the 4 co-chairs. The co-chairs, as you know, were Norway, European Union, US, and Japan, and was the only country that did not enforce the ban or enact the ban. More importantly, as the report itself observes, that Indian objections and opposition to the LTTE began to translate into very firmer backing to the government of Sri Lanka. And this is codified in the Norwegian report. And Sri Lankan government statements were subsequently given credibility and taken to their face value by the Indian government, and they were popularizing them or parroting them afterwards. And therefore, Sri Lankan government got it was done in order to ensure international credibility in the print media and in the electronic media. And the Sri Lanka Monitoring Mission also has said that India was heavily leaning on the side of the government of Sri Lanka, providing them with military hardware while the talks were going on, saying that they are for defensive purposes, and we know weapons are weapons, whether they are for defensive or offensive purposes, but it was a kind of a diplomatic camouflage to say that they were supplying only defensive weapons. At the same time, they also went around with, one second, my computer also got. Sorry. At the same time, they also went around with very strong and very strong diplomatic offensive. And we know that the Defense Secretary of the time, Mr. M.K. Narayanan, who is known for his anti-Tamil bickerings, he personally visited a number of countries, canvassing in favor of Sri Lanka and therefore against the LTTE. And he had certain personal interest in that, which we know subsequently from various other writings and observations made by people. Now, in my presentation, I'll focus on two issues, namely, I call it psychosocial aggression, and also there is a serious form of stigmatization, which has come upon the Tamils as a result of delisting. Aggression is often used as a political concept. It is an unjustified, planned, threatened, or other forms of action carried out by the use of force by one nation against another. And therefore, I use it advisedly to say that we Tamils suffer this as a nation. And we should never forget the fact that Tamils are not a minority, but they are a nationality. Ulam Tamils, particularly the Tamils of Tamil Ulam. And therefore, we need to start defining aggression, and our definition should fit in with the general definition of an aggression that is unjust, and an aggression that is devastating to a community and a nation. And that kind of aggressions include instrumental, hostile, relational, and also cyberbullying. By dictionary definition of aggression would come into that. Therefore, we need to tackle these specific forms of aggression, such as crime, workplace violence, bullying, violence in terms of verbal assault, and other forms of harassments. Now, this begins by a form of ethnic stigmatization that we suffer as a result of being Tamils. And we know in Sri Lanka, a person stood to be killed just because he or she is a Tamil. Our identity was enough to warrant death, disappearance, mutilation, murder, arbitrary arrest, and so on. Stigmatization continues because in their anxiety to gain quickly popularity and perhaps even substantial financial gain and other fringe benefits, there are researchers engaging in what they call terrorism research. And now that has been turned into diaspora research. And they tend to make labels or apply labels to the Tamil community, such as diaspora Tamil militancy, diaspora Tamil extremism, diaspora radicalization of Tamils, diaspora's long-distance nationalism. And some of the Tamils are doing it because perhaps it becomes, for them, it is lucrative to do it. And they have published academic journals with very dubious reputations and largely with propaganda motives and also to supply material to the different intelligence agencies in Canada and outside. Even though serious-minded scholars designate such writers and such essays as kind of paparazzi exercises, or some scholars even call them paparazzi academics. And well known among these there is a gentleman named Peter Schalk, not Peter Schalk. As you know, Professor Peter Schalk is a Swedish professor. There's another person with the name Peter Chalk, C-H-A-L-K. There's Michael Roberts, Amarnath Amarasingam, Camelia Nathaniel, Chandra Dharmavatna, and many others. Very recently, Chandra Dharmavatna, who is a professor at the Université de Montréal or University of Montreal, and who has recently published an article entitled How Canadian Legislators Reacted to Two Genocides Claims, and Canada's claimed support for conflict prevention in Sri Lanka. This person is teaching therefore at the Université de Montréal and also funded by the National Research Council of Canada at our taxpayers' money. I quote, he says, meanwhile, back in Canada, successive Canadian governments have failed to understand how this very hate speech, and what he calls hate speech is in fact the declaration of Genocide Studies Week. He names it as hate speech. Is being entrenched in Canadian municipal discourse and even in parliamentary proceedings by militant diaspora groups. And referring to the Tamils in Ontario, the same author laments, I quote, unfortunately, militant elements in diaspora groups who wish to replay the old ethnic animosities of their homelands in Canada, unquote. On the other hand, we also have forms of cyber terrorism directly or directed against the Tamils, particularly Tamil researchers, Tamil scholars, Tamil academics, youth leaders, charitable groups, religious leaders. And most of these are owned and operated by a band of singular groups or their associates, and allegedly supported and financed by the government of Sri Lanka. And these persons and these websites are in fact causing enormous psychological and social trauma to many Tamil individuals and community organizations, and also to the students who try to engage in research that would bring out the truth in deeper forms to sensitize and to bring it in the open to government agencies and others. But once they are labeled and marked and stigmatized, the hard work that they put in becomes futile. And all this is done in the name of attaching the LTT label to anyone and everyone who speaks for human rights, for social justice, for restitutional justice, or engage in humanitarian work in favor of war widows, amputees, and orphan children, or establish institutions and charitable organizations to support them. All these are very quickly labeled as LTT front organizations, and this goes on at a time when LTT, as we all know, does not exist as an institution. The listing of European Union and Canada also has given the government of Sri Lanka an open warrant, a kind of a carte blanche to arrest, detain, or even to murder and to maim any Tamil person, stating that Canada has declared LTT as a terrorist organization, EU has declared, and this, as we all know, has been parroted repeatedly. So the government of Sri Lanka that has not only refrained from protecting its own Tamil citizens during the pogroms of 1956, 1958, 1960, 1972, 1977, 1983, and so on, where the government's armed forces not only refrained from protecting the people, but actively took part in murders, in mutilations of Tamils, and also in aiding and abetting in the torching and looting of their properties. The listing of EU and Canada also gave Sri Lanka the power to deny to the Tamils the fundamental freedoms of expression, freedom of association, and it gave them also a false legitimacy for surveillance and to violate Tamil persons' right to privacy, both economic and social, and I would say even cultural. All this, as you would see, when it is being parroted out, often the citation underneath is Canada, EU, US, and several other countries have designated Tamil terrorism. And Tamil terrorism and LTT terrorism is sometimes used interchangeably in these writings. And these are cited, these are quoted to support positions taken by the different intelligence agencies and security agencies in Canada and outside. On the other hand, it also gives a false sense of legitimacy to all racially motivated extremists from the non-Tamil quarters and even from some Tamil quarters to write, to publish, to intimidate, and to label and stigmatize everyone. Another topic I would like to develop on is also the denial of memorialization. We know as an ancient community, remembering the dead is inseparably bound with our cultural and traditional practices, beginning with our families and also extending to the larger community. Memorializing is marked by activities and actions done to mourn and remember people, places, or even things that are of significance to individuals, families, and communities. Seen from a psychological angle, memorials have been celebrated, established. Sometimes memorial buildings or structures are erected in relation to people's memories and as mechanisms for coping with deep sense of grief, loss, and trauma. For example, memorialization has also been used by people to cope with the feelings of guilt, of forgetfulness, of the responsibility that is sometimes associated with the member who is a surviving member of a family. As we know, in some families, there are 6 members, 5 were killed and only 1 is left. But even that one is not permitted in Sri Lanka to remember the other 5 who were dead. There has been a number of literature being published today by different writers, not only looking at memorialization of victims of terrorism, as sometimes the titles would say, but also memorialization in terms of victims of state terrorism, the externalization of events, of persons, and to bring them out in order to remember them. Listing in various ways prevents us from this most foundational human exercise and experience. Externalization, as we also know, is necessary, and I quote from Olainer in his article on the externalization of function of memorials. And he says externalization is a necessary process that uses memorials to facilitate the use of objects in external reality to overcome internal conflicts that plague people's conscious after traumatic events. From the sociological perspective, research on memorials is varied and covers a wide range of topics such as the meanings attached to memorials and the basic functions of memorials. There is another author, Zitoun, who has written about memorials and semiotic dynamics on the journal Culture and Psychology. And he speaks about various angles from which these memorials could be seen, memorialization can be seen. First, they are used to reinforce notions of trust in the nation state, the ethnic identity and loss of that identity due to premeditated and vicious forms of annihilation of their communal identity by the power of the monoethnic state. And we all know how the government of Sri Lanka sought to not only to exterminate the very existence of our identity, but all identities of our existence are also were destroyed. Therefore, memorials help us to re-establish that identity with courage and firmness. And it helps us also to interact collectively with other people. Thirdly, they function as sites of mourning. And lastly, they provide opportunities of learning, in general, it's important to note that although the scope of research on memorials and memorializing is wide and diverse, this area has only been recently initiated, and we as a community constantly should remember, because forgetfulness is an antidote against our existence. As I have always said, stated and written, we Tamils need to continue with our memory, and we need to live with our memory. Listing erases that memory. Listing emphasizes forgetfulness and not allowing us to perpetuate that memory. These are the two major points that I wanted to focus on, and I hope as time is running out, and I hope as we open it for discussion, I will be able to state more. Thank you very much.
Yes. வாருங்கள் எல்லோரும் வடம் பிடிப்போம், போராட்டத் தேரை இழுத்தங்கள், தேசத்தை விடுவிப்போம் என்று தேசக்கவி புதுவை ரத்தினதுரை சொன்னார். Come on everybody, pull the rope of the chariot of the struggle, liberate our nation. புதுவை ரத்தினதுரை, the poet of the nation. He was subjected to enforced disappearance at the hands of the Sri Lankan military, last seen on 18th May 2009. The peace trap. The dilemma of the Tamils has always been making choices between what is pragmatic, as described from an Orientalist outside or theoretical perspective, and what is regarded as the absolute minimum irreversible guarantee to secure their collective rights in order to protect their existence as a people, nation, with equal rights as that of the Sinhalese in the island. Navigating the complex matrix full of such dilemmas is an area where Tamils need to excel. The topic we are discussing today is the peace trap. I have chosen the title, Tamil Dilemma of Peacemaking, while convincing the pragmatics of the global society and confronting the peace-building narratives of the state-centric and geopolitics-induced counter-insurgency and counter-terrorism paradigms. Canada is a diasporic home to the largest number of exiled Elam Tamils who fled genocidal onslaught in their traditional homeland, which is the northern and eastern parts of the island of Sri Lanka. The Tamil people in Canada look up to the host country as their second homeland, where they have integrated with dignity and equality, an opportunity rejected to them for decades by the predominant ethno-national group in their original land, where the main group, Sinhala Theravada Buddhists, falsely claim the island as their chosen island, according to the religious Mahavamsa doctrine, which was chronicled in 5th century CE with biased myths. Since this conference is about the Canadian responsibility, the second part of the topic is to look at the moral responsibility of the Elam Tamils in Canada and shed some light on how they could contribute positively to course correct the narratives that affect the Tamil struggle, with particular focus on the state responsibility of Canada and the role of the Canadian civil society. So let us look at the peace trap first. Although the peace process officially started on 22nd February 2002, we need to look at the developments both in the island and outside since 1996. You will understand why I say 1996 as we proceed with this presentation. So from 1997 to 1998, Operation Jayasee-Kurri, it was May 1997 it started, and LTT proscribed as the FTO in the USA in August that year, 1997. LTT's unceasing waves succeeded in May 1998, a year after the Operation Jayasee-Kurri. And after 1998, particularly in India, there was a BJP rule as it is now, ruled by Vajpayee. Indirect backing for peace process was obtained in 2001, 2002 from India during the Vajpayee time. LTT's paradigm-changing military victories marked 2000 and 2001. And in 2001, we have a genuine peace-making effort. From 2002 to 2003, US-UK seized the process through the so-called Tokyo co-chairs. And LTT was pressurized, but LTT manages to place a proposal, interim self-governing authority. From 2000 to 2004, we witnessed Kumaratunga sacking Ranil ministers, Karuna split, regime change in India. Now we have J.N. Dixit managing the Indian part from India, also the peace process indirectly. And then we have the tsunami. In 2005, Sivaram's assassination in April, P. Toms was nullified. Kadir Gamar assassination comes in August. EU travel ban in September. And Canada bans the LTT in April 2006. EU bans the LTT in May. EU had a travel ban earlier. From 2007 to 2008, we see the collapse of the CFA and the genocidal war begins. In 2009, war was waged as a genocidal onslaught. US provides key intelligence to the Sri Lankan military. From 2009 to 2020s, US continues port visits to, let us go to the other. US provides key intel to the SL military, and then you have Colombo tilting toward China, US-India strategic partners. And then you have 2013 to 2020, Xi Jinping becomes the China's leader. And then you have the BRI project launched. And then you have 2013, US Navy port visits to Trincomalee, Operation Balanced Style, again in 2020. We had the same Operation Balanced Style in 1996 in the South, when the US started to give military assistance to Sri Lanka. And again in 2020, the same operation, as also before in 2001, also they had this Operation Balanced Style. Hambantota port deal with Sri Lanka was done in the Ranil's time, and then you have Geopolitical Balancing Act again, nowadays, from 2020 to 2022.